Hello, everyone. We are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining the City Tech Collaborative webinar on waste management today. My name is Sonja.marziano, and I focus on user experience and product design for City Tech. In my role, I'm thinking about creating opportunities for users to give feedback on the projects and initiatives that we deploy so that we can create more impactful solutions for cities and the people that they serve. I'm also joined today by David Leopold, who is the Director of Product Management, and Alex Frank, who leads pilot program development at City Tech, and they're in the room with me today. These webinars are intended to be one strategy to engage civic and government leaders in the topics we're focusing on. City Tech runs quarterly workshops on a topic relevant to our partners and collaborators and leads to actionable pilots. For the first topic in 2018, we're going to be focusing on solutions that can improve waste management. We know that clean communities are a priority for cities around the world, and effective waste management can support a high-quality life of residents and reliable operations for businesses. This is happening in advance of an in-person cross-sector workshop that we are leading with Dover ESG next week. And we'll also invite additional key partners, stakeholders, and thought leaders to discuss and explore solutions. So a couple of housekeeping items before we jump in. We are going to be recording the presentation and specifically the presentations, and then sharing those publicly after the webinar ends. So we'll be sending that to you, as well as some additional next step items. You are all currently muted, but there's a chat function in GoToMeeting, and we ask that if you have any questions, just send them there. We have some dedicated time for a Q&A, so as the presentations go on, feel free to ask your questions through the chat and don't have to wait until the very end to ask those questions. So if something inspires you, write it out. We have those chat boxes monitored, and we'll be sure to answer as many questions as possible. So on your screen, you're going to see an agenda. I'm going to start us off and share a brief introduction on City Tech and our workshop and pilot process before we dive into 3 presentations. At the end of those presentations, like I said, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll discuss a couple of next step items that will happen after the webinar. So who are we? So City Tech is housed at UI Labs, which is a research and development center in Chicago that promotes university and industry partnerships, and is driving the digital future of manufacturing cities through 2 labs. The first one being the Digital Manufacturing Design Innovation Institute and City Tech. DMDII was launched with a focus on digital manufacturing in 2014. And then a year later, partners came together to launch what was City Digital to focus on smart urban infrastructure. Last month, actually, City Digital merged with Smart Chicago Collaborative to become City Tech. And Smart Chicago Collaborative was an organization formed in 2010 to increase people's access to the internet and to access to digital tools. And so now these 2 organizations, City Digital and Smart Chicago as City Tech, will think about cities as places where technology can fuel opportunity, inclusion, engagement, and innovation. And we're using cities as testbeds for new ideas when working with our partners, members, and residents to design, develop, and then scale solutions to other cities to solve urban problems. So we believe that the best solutions come from cross-sector partnerships and across not only industry and university, but also government. Our intention is to pilot new technology solutions in Chicago, but then to be able to scale and deploy those solutions throughout the world. We are currently easing subway congestion during large events. We're creating a digital map of Chicago's underground, and we're also launching a digital directory of public health services in Chicago. We see enormous opportunity to engage different sectors to not only identify the correct problem statement that creates challenges or barriers for cities and their residents, but to align that problem statement with other cities and identify appropriate solutions that could be tested and applied. We hope that if you have not engaged with City Tech, either as City Digital or Smart Chicago, or if it's been a while, then this is an opportunity to become re-engaged. And I'm going to share at the end, again, some ways that we can do this together. As I mentioned earlier, City Tech runs quarterly workshops. This is where our members, partners, cities, universities, companies, and other civic groups will come together and validate or build on a presented problem statement and then prioritize user needs and solutions. Workshops then lead to actionable pilots with defined objectives and can be an entry point for new partnerships. After the objectives have been defined and agreed upon, then a pilot team is formed and a scope of work is created. The goal of any pilot is to lead to results that can impact not only Chicago, but other cities nationally or globally. In addition, we see this webinar as an activity that's closely tied to this first step of opportunity discovery. Not only do we see it as a chance to highlight our partners and their unique perspectives around the topic, but we value the conversations and collaborations that these presentations can spark. So we can talk a little bit more at the end about the pilot process, but I really do want to dive into those presentations and get started with our partners. So first, we are going to hear from Eve Pytel, Director of the Delta Institute, which is a nonprofit group that collaborates with communities to solve complex environmental challenges across the Midwest. Eve leads Delta's portfolio to empower communities to solve challenges while increasing their economic and community development opportunities. She's going to speak on transforming waste from a liability to an asset. Then we'll hear from Ron Gonen, co-founder and CEO of the Closed Loop Fund. Closed Loop Fund invests in sustainable consumer goods, advanced recycling technologies, and the development of the circular economy. Ron will speak to cross-sector partnerships that can lead to a closed loop waste stream. And then last but not least, we will hear from Ken Beaver, Director of Processing Solutions for Dover Environmental Solutions Group, which provides innovative solutions that process, transport, and transform the solid waste stream into sustainable resources that benefit their customers and communities. And Dover will be our partner who is going to be jointly leading our workshop next week. So I want to thank Eve for joining us today, and I'm going to pass the baton to her.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for calling in. So we're just going to get into the presentation now. We're talking about transforming waste from liability to asset. And thanks to the awesome introduction to Delta and myself, I think we're just going to go to slide 3. Just to get started. Delta Institute is a nonprofit. We work on complicated challenges with a multidisciplinary staff, and we always want our work to inform stakeholders, inform better policy, but most importantly, create an on-the-ground solution. And that's really the sort of the backbone of our waste work. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about waste systems. And then we're also going to be talking about opportunities for transformation in resources, all in about 8 more minutes. So hold on to your hats. So we'll just move into the next slide, where one of the things that we think a lot about is how the waste is a circular system. And you hear this a lot. People want to talk about the circular economy and circular waste ideas. So this is really important to us. This is a sketch that we made a couple of years ago internally. We've tried to make fancier versions, but we always go back to this really rough looking version because it just speaks to us. So if you want to look at the top where it says import and export, one of the things that we always have to remember is that waste is, it's the result of some other group of decisions. And that's why this is such an interesting challenge. So for example, this is our system map of waste. So how waste or material, however, gets created. So if you look at the top where it says import and export, we import materials and then we process them. And then they might go to a manufacturer, and then they might go to a retailer, and then a consumer or business or some other group may buy it. So at all of those junctures, materials are being created and produced, but they also need to become disposed. And then at many different junctures, there's opportunity for waste that needs to be disposed. So you see that going to the right where you see the disposed arrows. So the red arrows are what we see as our liabilities, when the material is a liability. Then after it's disposed, it's picked up by maybe a garbage truck. It might go to a transfer station and then onto a landfill. And then depending on where you are and the infrastructure, perhaps it will go to waste to energy or not. We don't know. Or that material could take a different path where it's reused at several junctures, and at that point it's an asset. It can be transformed again into something else, or it can sort of continue to move around. So if we look at the left, we have reuse opportunities where we can reuse that thing as itself, or recycling opportunities where that can be transformed into something else, and then potentially can be used again as a feedstock. And so that's the best, because then we continue to use our material. Here you see these orange diamonds, and the reason why we've highlighted those is that these all yield fantastic barriers and challenges. You know, these are places where there's opportunity to engage with multiple stakeholders to look at reducing waste. That's often referred to as source reduction, or consumers. So you can always just not have the material, just not buy it or use it. And then there are all these different opportunities. And then you can always improve decision making, where it goes, and you can work with people to change their processes, look at the materials they use. And then maybe there's an opportunity for reducing the amount of waste by repurposing material, consuming less material, or having better systems and processes. And so if we get into sort of the next slide, this is really just another way to articulate some of those barriers to reuse and recycling. There's just so many. And again, we think that a lot of this is because waste is the consequence of other choices and decisions that were more primary. Typically, when somebody has materials to reuse from something, they didn't engage their first action to produce that waste. They were doing something that was more important. So as a result, because it is an afterthought, there's lots of challenges. So with education, this is something where there's consumer education, there's household education, there's a lot of contamination, which is where, even though we might have recycling systems, much of what can be put in a recycling bin, because of confusion, ends up contaminating the recycling, which makes it almost impossible for the hauler or recycling center to be profitable, and therefore undermines the whole system. And that's something that as UI Labs gets more into this, and City Tech gets more into this, I'm sure that there'll be lots of discussion about that. The other thing which is complicated is global markets. There's a lot of users of materials. The materials are sourced sometimes from very far away. And then the other thing is to have a lot of materials recycled, especially if they're going to be manufactured again, requires going back to the global marketplace. And if there isn't demand for the materials, that can be a challenge as well. And then again, complex systems. There's users on every level, whether it's an individual or a large business, or maybe a university or a municipality. They're all operating in different ways. And so what might be a really good solution for one type of user is not workable for the other one. So with that, that's just sort of to whet your appetite for all the challenges that could be pursued. So if we keep moving to our next area, one of the other things that we see, and I apologize for the graphics, we've sort of been thinking about this idea but haven't created a really good graphic, but we also think about waste as being a way and users being disconnected from materials. Our personal experience frequently is that if I have a yucky material and I'm done with it, I've lost interest in it, and I put it in the trash can, then I don't really care what happens afterwards as long as it goes away. And one of our challenges in rethinking the waste system and transforming this waste into opportunity is to keep the material closer to home where we have more options, more interventions, and can reuse that. So if we can, for example, take that paper that hasn't been used and send it to a school, or even just give it to a neighbor or some other group, that's better than if we have to send it to another center to be recycled and then ship it 2,000 or 7,000 miles away so that it can be put back into another manufacturing process. So a lot of times we just don't feel this connection, and so our waste is away. We think it's been managed well, and really it just hasn't been. So if we had a long-term connection to our waste, we may feel differently. So then if we move on, and we're sort of close to the end of this, is that there's a lot of different potential solutions. There's a lot of different opportunities that cities, institutions, businesses, and different folks have. We can always reduce the amount of waste. That would require us to think about our behavior. That would require us to think about waste very differently, because from a data standpoint, when we do the best with waste, it doesn't even show up in the system, right? And that's because it doesn't get into a trash can. It doesn't go to a transfer station where it is weighed. It just gets repurposed. And so there's a lot of different opportunities to support entrepreneurs who are trying to find that value, trying to repurpose those goods. There's also a lot of policy opportunities, because you can attack the decisions that cause waste. We can also look at how we manage waste and how we transfer it, and a whole variety of different policy options. Additionally, on the municipal side, especially with recycling, municipal waste contracts create a lot of opportunity for improvement. There's opportunities to leverage those contracts for better education, better equipment, better bins, and so there's a lot of ways that you can use those opportunities. However, that's not necessarily easy, because that might require a big effort and big investment. And then on the other sides, there's simply things like really trying to look again, what are ways that you can use more sustainable products so that you are not disposing of hazardous products and other things. So there's a virtually limitless work to do here. So we're very excited to sort of get into that. And then I think finally, if you're interested in any of these materials, we have a lot of resources on our website. And we have a helpful waste 101. So if you want to know what happens to that banana peel when it gets put in the trash can, there's a handy document which will take you through that. We have example waste procurement tools, which you can use if you're looking at your contracts. And anyone can use that, but those are really specific to residential. We have a couple of big papers which look at job potential from different decisions around waste, as well as other single-use goods. But with that, we're just excited to be in the dialogue and look forward to talking more with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eve, for your presentation. I will be sure to send out that link to all of the webinar attendees as well. So if you haven't scribbled it down, please expect that in an upcoming email from me. Moving on, we are going to switch gears, and we are going to hear from Ron at Closed Loop Fund. Ron, as you present, please just let me know when to move to the next slide, and I'll be sure to do that for you.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. The good thing about how this has been scheduled is my slides are going to hopefully be a good follow to Delta's presentation on what the issues are and what some potential solutions are. Hopefully I'll show you today what some of those specific solutions are and opportunities to invest in the space. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. You can go ahead and click to bring up the different boxes. So first I'm going to start off with an introduction to our firm and what we do. Closed Loop Partners invest in business and technologies that optimize product supply chains and build the circular economy. We have 3 funds under management that help us do this. First, we have a project finance fund that finances large-scale recycling infrastructure around the country. So for instance, we financed Lakeshore which is the recycling facility in the city of Chicago. We financed Eureka, which is the company that built the recycling facility and does the collection in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We financed Green Mantra's facility. That's an advanced plastics recycling facility up in Canada. And the unique thing about the way we finance these projects is we lend money out at below market rates. The reason we can lend money out at below market rates is because who our investors are. As you can see, our investors in this fund are exclusively the world's largest consumer goods companies, and their primary interest in our fund is they want to build infrastructure to get this material back to their supply chain. So that's our project finance fund. We then have a growth equity fund called Closed Loop Ventures, and that's for family offices, high net worth individuals that want to invest in impact, they want to invest in the circular economy, and they want to see strong financial returns. And there we do early stage investing. You can go to our website and see all of the different unique companies that we've invested in. It ranges from home biogas, which is a household size anaerobic digester, to AMP Robotics, which is the first robotics and artificial intelligence company for the recycling industry, to Evernew, which has a process to deconstruct cotton clothing. So we have a lot of innovative companies in that fund. And then we have a research and development group that for the past 2 years has been doing grant making and research into bottlenecks. That's going to evolve this year into what we call the Center for Circular Economy, NYC. We're going to be launching a center in New York City that'll be focused on the circular economy. And that center will include an incubator space, and it'll include a convening space. In regards to the convening space, we found that before you spend any money on any of these bottlenecks, first you want to make sure all the right players are in the room and discussing what the bottlenecks are and the potential solutions. And there'll also be a place for panels, and we're going to have some research fellows sitting there as well. So that gives you a little bit of background on who we are and what we do. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this gives you a sense of some of the different investments that we've made. You can see on the project finance side, I mentioned a few of the investments. You can see them on the left-hand side, so you can look them up. It's a combination of investments into private companies, as well as sometimes we lend directly to municipalities. So in the case of City of Memphis, you can see up there, they had no recycling program up until a few years ago when our firm was able to step in and lend them a few $1 million to buy recycling carts for every household, and they're paying us back through landfill diversion savings and commodity revenue. You can see the different ventures on the growth equity side, and then some of the things we've done on the research and development side. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. This are two major convenings that we've done in the last year. I want to point you to the panel that you see up there on the right-hand side. On that panel is Procter & Gamble, Walmart, the sanitation commissioner for the city of New York, and one of the largest recycling companies in North America. In the audience was dean of one of the top product design schools in North America. What was interesting about this panel is none of these folks talk to each other frequently about packaging, design, recycling, even though they're all tremendously dependent on each other to make sure that what they're trying to accomplish is successful. And so that's one of the things we're going to try to do with our center, is take panels like this that we're able to put together and formalize them so that we open up those channels of communication. You go ahead, go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to show this model to folks because it helps people understand what we're trying to solve for. Everybody understands that recycling and the circular economy is good for the environment. We are able to save and preserve our natural resources, but there's a major economic opportunity as well. And what you're looking at here is a map that shows you where municipal solid waste is trucked, barged, railed around the United States looking for landfill space. You don't need to know much about the recycling industry, logistics, or much else to know that there's massive amount of inefficiency and cost here. And what we're trying to do and build out the circular economy is essentially clean up this map. We shouldn't have these arrows of garbage being transported all over the country. Things should be recycled, preferably locally, and turned into product locally and get back into market. Or in the case of food waste, should be going through a digester to create energy or compost facility. So I wanted to give everyone both an illustrative sense of the problem, but also the opportunity. From a financial standpoint, U.S. municipalities spend about $5 billion a year exporting waste to landfill. Previous to this position, I was the Deputy Commissioner of Sanitation and Recycling and Sustainability in the Bloomberg administration. In New York City, before I got there, we were spending about $400 million a year exporting waste to landfill. And I used to explain the economic opportunity around recycling and the circular economy to people by saying, if anybody walks in my office with a ability to recycle all of our waste instead of sending it to landfill for $399 million a year, they got a deal. So there's the economic opportunity. If you go to the next slide, please. And this is what we look for in the circular economy. You can see that map before is dirty with lines going which way and that way. And instead, we're trying to build this type of beautiful, clean, circular system where there's clear consumer marketing, there's robust municipal infrastructure to collect the product and packaging that we market to consumers should be recycled. There's recycling facilities that are located regionally that have advanced technologies. There's processing infrastructure in place that can take recycled material and turn it back into new products. And then there's the product and packaging manufacturers that are eager to use this material and recycle using recycled material. You can go to the next slide, please. And that's my presentation for today. That's a little bit about us, and you can learn more about us on our website at closedlooppartners.com. And we're always looking for investment opportunities and solutions to back. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Ron. We will also send out the link to your website in our post-webinar email. And thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate this. I want to encourage, again, to our attendees to, if you have any questions on Eve's or Ron's presentations, to please go ahead and ask those in the chat box, and we'll get to them very shortly. Moving forward, we're going to hear from Ken Beaver. And Ken, what I'm going to do, as we discussed, is I'm actually going to share the keyboard and mouse control with you. So
okay.
One moment as
Thank
I
you,
do
Sonja.
that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm Ken Beaver, Director of Processing Solutions for Environmental Solutions Group. We are one of a couple of dozen operating companies of the Dover Corporation, an $8 billion publicly traded company based in Downers Grove, Illinois. And ESG is the parent company of some brands you may have heard of: Pytel, Marathon, Third Eye, among others. We design, build, and service equipment for the collection and processing of municipal solid waste from the point where that waste is created to its ultimate destination and use. So if you are an organization that either collects or processes solid waste, chances are you utilize some of our equipment. Our focus today will be in a couple of areas where technology is transforming our industry. Okay, in a little bit, I'm going to talk about diversion of food waste, but I'm going to start with refuse collection and improved utilization of these significant assets, namely refuse collection vehicles. And there's a huge opportunity here for a number of reasons, starting with safety. The collection of solid waste is one of the most dangerous industries in this country, with a fatality rate that's about 10 times the average industry. There's been some progress on this front, but there's still a huge opportunity for improvement. Additionally, productivity is an area that is not often looked at when it comes to collecting solid waste. Waste collection fleets, in many ways, do exactly the same thing as any manufacturing facility would do. And yet, those fleets, when they're sent out in the morning, do not have any of the information that is typical of a manufacturing facility to make better decisions. So the operators of those assets are in essence on their own once they're out on those routes. So our opportunity here is to utilize digital technology, in other words, extracting information off of those garbage trucks to impact this combination of safety, productivity, operating expenses, and even revenue and pricing opportunities. It is not unusual on commercial routes, as an example, for 10% of the picks to not be billed for one reason or another. So imagine you are incurring the cost of those picks and yet not collecting the revenue associated with 10% of them. Another example on the pricing side is playing what-if scenarios. If I were to drop a certain customer or add a certain customer on a route that I'm already collecting, what would be my impact to my revenue and to my profitability if I do that? So this is a nice overview schematic of how we look at digital solutions as they apply to refuse collection vehicles. First and foremost is the basic extraction of data from the garbage truck itself. So there has to be some kind of a sensor that captures a signal utilizing some sort of hardware. That signal is converted to raw data, and then that data is typically sent to the cloud, where some form of analytics are used to convert that raw data into useful information. It's very easy to get caught up in the technology and get excited about a certain technology, but our focus is always on the customer first, helping that customer make better decisions. So we work for our customers to provide the right information to the right person at the right time to help them improve safety, efficiency, and reliability of their operations. Here's an example of how digital solutions are evolving on a garbage truck. So in the area of safety, over the last 10 years, onboard cameras have become standard equipment. And 10 years ago, they were a luxury. Now they're almost on every single vehicle. In the next 10 years, we think the same thing is going to happen with video analytics. In other words, the capturing of video based on certain events and using sophisticated software to recognize what those analytics are telling you about a safety event. And this could be an accident. This could be a variety of different issues that are now captured. And the benefit of this, among other things, is to provide feedback to drivers, customized feedback based on that particular driver's weaknesses. It also provides useful information to safety and training managers, to operations managers, to risk and insurance managers. And so now you have this terrific information coming off of a garbage truck that can be utilized. The other area I'm going to touch on now is the diversion of food waste. And there are some nice tailwinds in terms of enabling this in the terms of new regulations that provide incentive, but those regulations don't provide the funding or the technologies to economically and effectively divert that food waste. Source separation is a process that's been commonly adopted in many communities, but there are real challenges with source separation. Contamination is one of them, and low route densities, especially in residential routes, is another. And that means that the costs associated with that source separation are much higher than you might expect. We believe that the key to making the diversion of food waste economical is actually on the back end, the development of high value end products. Today, it's typically compost and biogas. Those economics can sometimes be challenging. In the future, we believe there will be more efforts to develop fertilizers, biochar, synthetic fuels, designer grades of compost, and other very targeted end products. Today, a typical AD or compost facility is generating 80% of its revenue from tipping fees and only 20% of its revenue from the sale of the end product. And we believe for this to be economically viable, that ratio has to be reversed. This chart shows you why food waste is the primary target these days in our industry. So the x-axis of this chart represents the recycling rate for these different material groups. The y-axis represents the growth of that recycling rate, and the bubble size represents how much of that material is landfilled each year. And so food, you can see as a group, has the lowest recycling rate. It's only 5.1% as of 2014. It's probably a little higher now, but still in the single digits. It is growing rapidly, almost 8% compound annual growth, and it represents 29 million tons a year of landfill. When you look at food waste, wood waste, yard waste, and paper, which would all be considered organic materials, those four materials combined represent over half of what goes into a landfill. So this really demonstrates why food waste is the opportunity. We are certainly early in the evolution of the technology for these materials. On the collection side, we have source separation. We have changes in bin collection strategies. We have blue bags, which I'll talk about in a minute. On the separation front, we have screening, pressing, depackaging of food waste, and other processes. On the processing side, you can process physically through things like chipping and shredding. You can process chemically through composting and AD, or you can process thermally through pyrolysis or plasma gasification. Here's an example of how to improve source separation. So these blue bags, which come from Organic Solutions, are specifically designed to be compostable. They're BPI certified, and most important, when those bags are thrown into the trash and then that trash is put into a refuse collection vehicle, those bags survive the compaction in that refuse collection vehicle, about 98% plus survival rate. So what that means is that when you get to your transfer station, those blue bags, which are still intact, can be pulled out either manually or with a robotic sorting process. And now you have clean food waste, source separated, without having to add a route or a truck. The other technology I want to talk about is called a Vercel system. This utilizes a combination of heat and vacuum to convert water to steam and, in essence, blow up the cell walls from the inside out and dramatically increase the surface area of that organic waste, especially paper. Paper and OCC are not capable of producing biogas if untreated with this Vercel pre-process. Not only do you get higher gas production or faster compost from the organics, but also from the paper as well. So those are a couple of key technologies that we're focused on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take control back now. Thank you so much, Ken. And we will move into some questions. Oh. Okay, there we go. So I have a couple of questions in the chat box, but please continue to share them with me. So the first question I have is, if I have a traditional waste system and are looking to innovate, should I start with regulation, new technologies, or both?
So this is Eve, and I'll start broader as I did before, and I'm sure the other speakers will have better things to add to this. But I think that the most important thing is to start by figuring out things about your behavior and what is your waste. Find out from your haulers and look at what are you throwing away, what are you recycling, what are you repurposing, but also look at some of the really basic things at the facility, because one of the things that we've found in our facility audits and other things to serve, whether it's in a lunchroom or a commercial office building or even at a processing place, is that there's a lot of very basic things about how waste is managed, which might have to do with signage and shapes of containers and things that can really undermine things from the start. So I think that getting an idea of how you are behaving, how your firm or people are behaving, and then looking at that before you get into technology as well as all these other things is pretty important. And I think that's really, I think some of the technology and other things and other infrastructure are critically important part of it, but you need to know sort of where you are first before you can figure out whether you need to be hooked up with a place that can dispose to an anaerobic digester or something else. So happy to yield that to other speakers.
This is Ken. I'll add to that. We also believe that documenting that current state is a critical first step, and that typically will start with a waste characterization study. You know, what exactly is the mix of your waste? And if you haven't done one in the last 10 years, that's probably a good starting point. The next thing we certainly like to take a look at is what we would call a value stream map, which is literally from the point where that waste is created to its ultimate destination, map that out in detail, show what the mass flows are, show what the economics are, and include all of the different organizations involved in that process. So it's very typical in a municipality to have, you know, different organizations that own different parts of that process, but you need to map it out from waste generation to ultimate destination and use, even though there may be several organizations involved. And then once you have that current state, then you can identify where the areas of opportunity are.
Great. So moving to another question, the overall waste stream map showed so many groups involved in the process. Who are the top partners cities should prioritize when trying to innovate around this area?
I can, this is Ron, I can take a first shot at that. I think one thing that's definitely missing that would go a long way is I think municipalities need to reach out to major consumer brands companies more and vice versa to make sure that there's a understanding about the cost of introducing packaging into the market that's not recyclable, as well as what incentives could be provided for using more recycled material in their packaging. What I mean by that is if you talk to a lot of executives at consumer goods companies about the importance of recycling, they still focus on it from a, we'd like to do more, we know it's good for the environment, as opposed to getting a different message, and one that I think would make them pay much greater attention, which is when you introduce this product or this product that you're selling, because it's not recyclable, cost taxpayers X millions of dollars to landfill, and this mayor wants to eliminate that cost, they get a much different message, which is my product and packaging is a financial burden on this municipality, and they may look to alleviate that burden by banning my packaging, passing a tax or fee, or providing an incentive to my competitor who has more recyclable packaging. So I think municipalities need to reach out to executives and consumer goods companies more and help them understand the economics around introducing packaging that's not recyclable. And likewise, I think companies need to do a better job of reaching out to cities and to states and say, hey, I could probably use a lot more post-consumer recycled material in my packaging. I could probably do some manufacturing in your state, but I need some tax incentives in order to kind of get that off the ground, or at least I need to know that if I'm doing that, I'm not having to directly compete with someone who's not doing that and maybe getting something at lower cost or skirting environmental regulations.
So I completely agree with Ron. I think that that's a huge part of the feedstock of what we're seeing, and getting ahead of waste before it gets in the system is great. But for municipalities, and it doesn't matter what size you are, you could be a very small municipality or county, and this is totally relevant to you. What you can recycle is really based on the technology at the mixed recycling facility that your hauler or that you are sending your recycling to. And one of the things that has been found is that a lot of times bad education and marketing materials do not actually accurately say what can be recycled in your region, which creates a lot of havoc for the actual facilities, because it's sort of, if they don't have the technology to deal with a certain material, then that's essentially contamination for them that they're going to be landfilling anyway. So one of the things that I think is really important is that a municipality is going to talk first to a bunch of different stakeholders, and when they're working on their procurement contract, they're going to be able to include some stipulations. And so I would look very carefully at the contract. What are you buying as a service? Do you have education? Do you know where your materials are going? And then is there actual communication which is going to enable the recycling facility to provide information back so that they are not getting a bad load in the first place? So that's completely boring and it sounds very mundane. However, we know that specifically in the Chicago metropolitan region that very few municipalities, and I would get the stats wrong right now, but we know that very few municipalities have accurate information about their recycling programs. And it's not for their lack of trying, it's that they've used things from the EPA, they've been informed by different groups. However, it's not reflective of the capacity in their community.
This is Ken. I'll just add a couple of comments as well. Of course, all of the equipment manufacturers can help you understand the latest new technology. Because we're involved with both processing and collecting, I think we have a broader view than many others. But if you don't have the in-house knowledge to assess that technology, utilizing a consultant is sometimes a very good idea as well. Somebody who is technology agnostic. There's a number of very good industry consultants out there. People like Kessler and GBB are just a couple of examples, but there are many others. And those folks can really help you assess the appropriateness of any given technology for your particular situation.
Great. So I have another question here. Since food waste has the most potential in both producing energy and reducing landfill use, what are some ideas to introduce everyday people to separating their organic waste from their regular waste?
Well, this is Ken. I can start on that, and I'm sure Ron and Eve have comments as well. One particular program we like that I talked about here briefly was the Blue Bag program for residences. You have a small bag that goes into your kitchen, you put your food scraps into it, and on a regular basis, you take that little blue bag, you tie it up, you put it in your trash bin, and it is co-collected with the trash and then separated at the transfer station. And so that overcomes the issue of low route densities and typically yields a very pure food waste material that can go directly to that compost facility. So for municipalities that are looking to do pilot programs or to start up without a huge investment on residential source separation of food waste, we think this particular approach makes a lot of sense compared to buying new bins and putting new trucks on the road and creating new routes and all of that sort of thing.
So I have time for one more question, and this question seems to be directed at Ken. Do drivers need feedback, or do customers need it? Is there a way to get feedback to customers using ESG tools?
Yes, absolutely. And that is, you know, historically, really over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a tremendous amount of additional information put into a cab for a driver, to the point where it's almost like an airplane cockpit. It's almost too busy. And so a lot of our effort now in our industry is to really try to streamline and consolidate all of those bells and whistles and alarms and screens and so forth inside the cab. But until very recently, there wasn't anything going back to the home office, either to the operations managers or the municipalities themselves. And this is the new frontier here, where we're able to extract this raw data, put it into the cloud, and use analytics to create different timely reports and information for different users. So whether you're an operations manager or a risk manager or a pricing manager or whatever your role may be, or if you're a municipality trying to track statistics on recycling rates and compliance and things like that, then this new ability to not just extract but to analyze data coming off of trucks is really where the frontier is right now.
All right, so before we end the webinar, I want to first thank our speakers again for their contributions today, for taking the time for not only to prepare for the presentation, but to spend time on the webinar today. As we end our conversation, I wanted to give a couple of next steps that you can take. So first, we encourage you to join our LinkedIn group. This is a place where we are encouraging conversations with partners around the work that we're doing or the topics that we are addressing. And I will send these links to you after the webinar via an email. Second, I am starting a City Network newsletter. This is specifically for the audience that's here today, civic, nonprofit, and government groups. The communications will be pretty minimal, but it's specifically to invite you to activities that are designed for civic or government stakeholders. If you have any questions about what we covered today, whether that's around the topic, our workshop, our pilot process, or City Tech Collaborative, I encourage you to email me. And then lastly, we have created a survey to capture your thoughts and priorities and experiences in your city, specifically around waste management. So we hope that you can spend a few minutes just sharing your own perspective or your own challenges or successes that you've seen in your city. We're hoping that we can capture different experiences that could later inform the program that we're running, as well as find new opportunities to collaborate across cities. So I will send all of these things to you in an email, as well as a copy of the recording of this presentation. I want to thank you all for being here and look forward to continuing the conversation offline. Thank you, everyone.